Hey, future biologists. Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's not just on Mr. Martin's IB biology syllabus, but is a foundation of ecology itself. Ecological niches.
And don't worry if English isn't your first language. We'll break it down so it makes sense no matter where you are in your biology journey.
We're going deep, but we'll make sure it's crystal clear for everyone.
An ecological niche you can think of as a species' unique role in its ecosystem.
So it's not just about where they live.
It goes way beyond just habitat. It's about their whole job description in that ecosystem.
Okay, so like what they eat?
What they eat, how they get their food, who they interact with, and how they deal with things like oxygen or sunlight. It's the whole package.
More complex than just saying this animal lives in the forest then. It's about all the intricate ways they fit into their environment.
Exactly. And just like jobs in our human society, there's a huge diversity of ecological niches out there.
Some species are generalists then, like the jack of all trades.
Right, they can handle a bit of everything. And then you have the specialists, incredibly skilled at a very particular task, like a brain surgeon, perhaps.
Love that analogy. But to really grasp how these ecological jobs work, we need to break things down a bit.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the most basic need, how organisms get their energy. We call this their mode of nutrition.
Ah, yes, the fueling station of life. And it's amazing how diverse life is when it comes to this.
Well, we humans are pretty straightforward, right? We eat food.
True, but other organisms have evolved some seriously ingenious strategies to power themselves.
Like plants. They don't need to go grocery shopping.
Not at all. They've got that ultimate life hack, photosynthesis, using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to create those sugars for energy.
But it's not just plants, is it?
You're right. Algae, some bacteria, they're all masters of photosynthesis. And think about it. Photosynthesis is responsible for the oxygen we breathe. It's not just a cool science fact. It's literally shaped the evolution of life on Earth.
Wow, puts things into perspective. So plants have their way, but what about us animals? We eat other organisms to get energy.
You got it. That's called Holozoic Nutrition. And that process itself is quite a chain of events. Ingestion, digestion, absorption, assimilation, and finally, egestion.
Okay, so eat it, break it down, absorb the good stuff, use it, get rid of the rest. Sounds pretty familiar.
But then you have those rule breakers like euglena.
Euglena, what's so special about them?
Well, they can switch things up. They can do photosynthesis and eat other organisms depending on what's available.
So they're flexible.
Exactly. Multi-talented. We call those organisms mixotrophs. Some, like euglena, are facultative mixotrophs. They can switch between modes as needed.
So they have options.
Precisely. While others are obligate mixotrophs, they need both strategies to survive. But let's not forget the decomposers. Those unsung heroes.
Yes, the cleanup crew.
Fungi and bacteria, the master recyclers. Breaking down those dead organisms and waste products, releasing nutrients back into the ecosystem.
It's like a constant cleanup and prep for new life.
A crucial role. And then there's archaea, often found in those extreme environments.
Extreme.
Single-celled organisms, but they've got some incredibly diverse modes of nutrition, using everything from sunlight to chemicals like sulfur or methane.
Wow, surviving on things we'd consider toxic. Talk about adaptable. Speaking of which, let's talk about oxygen. It's essential for us humans.
Essential for many, but for some, it's actually toxic.
Wait, really? Oxygen can be poisonous. That's hard to wrap my head around. We need it to breathe.
It all comes down to how organisms use it in their metabolism. Like us, many organisms are obligate aerobes. We need oxygen for survival, using it to generate energy. But then there are obligate anaerobes, they can't handle oxygen at all.
So where do they even live if oxygen is everywhere?
They've found their niches in places where oxygen is scarce. Deep underwater sediments, the guts of some animals, even places like hot springs. And then you have the facultative anaerobes.
Facultative, that sounds like they're a bit more flexible.
Exactly. They can use oxygen if it's around, but switch to a different energy-making process when it's not. Think of E. coli, or yeast.
Like having a backup generator. So handy when you live in a place where oxygen levels fluctuate.
It lets them thrive in a wider range of habitats, and that adaptability is a big part of understanding a species' niche. But let's move from how they breathe to how they eat. Specifically, some of the fascinating adaptations for feeding and survival.
Well, teeth tell a story, don't they? Especially when we look at our own ancestors, the hominids, like Paranthropus robustus, massive molars, right?
Huge, suggesting a diet heavy on tough plant material. And then you contrast that with Homo floresiensis, smaller, more generalized teeth.
pointing towards a more omnivorous diet.
Precisely, it gives us clues about their lifestyle, like a window into their past.
Amazing what you can learn from teeth. But it's not just what they ate, but how they got it. Like herbivores, cows, grasshoppers, they've evolved specialized mouth parts to efficiently graze on plants.
And plants aren't just sitting there defenseless, they've evolved their own defenses. Thorns, toxic compounds, waxy surfaces.
To deter those hungry herbivores.
A constant evolutionary arms race. Which brings us to another epic showdown. Predator versus prey.
Now that's a classic. Claws, venom, camouflage predators have some serious weapons in their arsenal.
And prey have evolved their countermeasures. Camouflage to blend in, mimicry to imitate dangerous creatures living in groups for safety. It's a dance of adaptations.
Each one pushing the other to evolve, like an ecological spy movie. But what about plants competing for resources? I imagine sunlight is a hot commodity in a dense forest.
You're absolutely right. In a forest, it's a race to the top. And different plants have evolved different strategies to capture those precious rays.
Like those towering canopy trees. They dominate the skyline, investing all their energy in growing tall and strong with those thick trunks and massive crowns.
Then you have the lianas. Those woody vines that use trees like their personal elevators. They climb towards the light, using tendrils, hooks, even spines to cling on. Talk about resourceful.
And we can't forget the epiphytes, those plants that grow on other plants, like setting up shop on tree branches.
Accessing sunlight without having to invest in all that trunk and branch structure. Some epiphytes, like orchids, have aerial roots to absorb moisture and nutrients straight from the air. And then there are the strangler figs.
Strangler figs, those sound intense.
They start out innocent enough, as epiphytes, but their roots grow down, around the host tree. Eventually, they can strangle it.
Ruthless, but effective. But what about those plants stuck on the shady forest floor? How do they survive with such limited sunlight?
That's where shade-tolerant plants have the advantage. They've evolved to thrive in low-light conditions. Larger leaves to capture what sunlight they can, higher chlorophyll content for maximum efficiency.
So they've mastered making the most of what they've got.
Exactly. And this leads us to a crucial concept in ecology, the competitive exclusion principle.
Okay, this sounds intriguing. What is this principle all about?
Simply put, it states that two species competing for the same limited resources can't coexist indefinitely. Eventually, one will outcompete the other.
Leading to?
Either the weaker competitor goes extinct in that area, or they have to find a different way to survive.
So it's like ecological musical chairs. Someone's always going to be left standing when the music stops.
A great analogy. But instead of being voted off the island, the less competitive species might have to find a new niche, a new way to thrive.
So ecosystems are in a constant state of all-out war then. Species battling it out for every scrap of food and every inch of space.
Well, it's not always that dramatic. Remember resource partitioning.
Right, where species divide up the resources.
And exactly. And this is often driven by that competitive exclusion principle. It's like they realize, hey, if we want to all live here, we need to figure out how to share without stepping on each other's toes.
So competition can lead to more diversity then. That seems counterintuitive.
No. It might seem that way, but it's a powerful force in shaping ecosystems. Competition pushes species to specialize, reducing conflict and allowing more variety.
Like that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Precisely. The need to avoid being outcompeted drives innovation in how species use resources. And that brings us to the distinction between fundamental and realized niches.
Right, you mentioned that before. Could you explain it a bit more?
Sure. Imagine a species' fundamental niche as its ideal job, the one it's perfectly suited for based on its adaptations, the full range of conditions and resources it could use if there were no competition.
So their dream job, with all the skills and qualifications to excel.
Exactly, but like in the real world, competition often limits their ability to land that dream job. The realized niche is the job they actually get, the portion of their fundamental niche they can occupy given the competition.
So it's like settling for a job that's not perfect but allows them to survive.
A compromise, shaped by the realities of the ecosystem, are shade-tolerant plant friends. Their fundamental niche might include sunnier spots, but competition pushes them to specialize in the shade.
Even though they could technically handle the sun, they're more successful in the shade because there's less competition there.
Exactly. It shows that success in nature isn't always about being the biggest or strongest. It's about finding the right spot where you can truly excel. And speaking of niches, they're not static. They can change over time.
Wait, they're not set in stone. So a species doesn't get assigned a niche at birth and that's it for life.
Nope, not at all. Environments are constantly changing, whether it's due to climate change, natural disasters, or human activities. These changes can alter resource availability, the types of competition, even the physical landscape.
So species have to adapt or risk being left behind.
You got it. They might expand their niche, contract it, or even switch to a totally different one to survive these changes. That adaptability is key to their long-term survival.
So it's not just about finding the right niche, but being flexible enough to adjust it as needed.
And that's where the diversity of adaptations we've been talking about is so important. Species with a wider range of tolerances, behaviors, and feeding strategies have a better chance of weathering those ecological storms.
Like having a diverse toolkit. The more tools you have, the more problems you can solve. And speaking of diversity, this brings us to an important point about biodiversity itself.
Absolutely.
So why is biodiversity so crucial? Remind us.
A diverse ecosystem is like a well-oiled machine. Each species has a unique role that contributes to its overall stability and resilience. When you have a variety of niches filled, the ecosystem can handle disturbances better.
Like having a team of specialists, each with their own expertise, working together to solve problems.
Precisely. But when you lose biodiversity, when species disappear or their niches are disrupted, it's like losing key players on that team. The ecosystem becomes less efficient, less resilient, and more vulnerable to collapse.
So protecting biodiversity isn't just about saving cute animals. It's about protecting the health and functioning of entire ecosystems.
Exactly. Understanding ecological niches helps us see why biodiversity is so critical. Every species, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, has a unique and important role to play.
Like a giant, intricate web, and every thread is important.
Now, going back to those guiding questions we started with, what are the advantages of specialized modes of nutrition? And how are a species' adaptations related to its niche?
Okay, so after all this, what are the answers? What have we learned?
Well, we've seen that specialized modes of nutrition allow species to reduce competition. They focus on specific resources, which helps drive biodiversity and ensures that each species has a unique role.
And adaptations. It seems pretty clear that a species' adaptations, whether it's their teeth or claws, their behavior, or their ability to tolerate certain conditions, are what allow them to occupy a particular niche.
Absolutely right. Their adaptations are their tools for performing their ecological job. And as we've seen, those adaptations can be incredibly diverse.
It's like nature has an endless supply of creativity when it comes to equipping species for their unique roles.
And this understanding has important implications for conservation.
Okay, I'm curious. How does it all tie into conservation efforts?
When we understand a species' niche, its needs and interactions, we can better protect its habitat and manage its populations.
Like having a detailed job description so we know what they need to thrive.
Exactly. We can identify crucial resources, potential threats, and ways to reduce human impact by considering the niche of each species we're trying to conserve.
So it's like being a career counselor for endangered species.
In a way, yes. And this knowledge informs everything from habitat restoration to wildlife management strategies.
Wow, this deep dive is really opening my eyes to how complex and interconnected ecosystems are.
I'm glad to hear it. And we've only just scratched the surface. But before we move on, let's leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question.
Hit us with it. What should we be pondering?
If a species' niche is like its job, what happens when the environment changes drastically and those jobs become obsolete? How can species adapt, evolve, or even reinvent themselves to survive in a rapidly changing world? And what does that tell us about how urgently we need to address climate change and habitat loss?
Heavy questions, but crucial ones. This deep dive is giving us the tools to start thinking about these challenges in a new way. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have more to explore in this fascinating world of ecological niches. Stick with us for the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive on ecological niches.
We've been exploring how species carve out their unique roles in ecosystems, from how they get energy to how they deal with competition.
And it's not just about where a species lives, right? But how it interacts with its environment and other species.
Right, it's like their resume, their skills, their rivals in this ecological job market.
I like that, their ecological resume.
So it's not just about finding the right niche, but being flexible enough to adjust it as needed.
You're absolutely right, and that's where the diversity of adaptations we've been talking about comes in. Species with a wider range of tolerances, behaviors, feeding strategies, they're more likely to weather those ecological storms.
It's like having a diverse toolkit. The more tools you have, the more problems you can solve, so to speak. And speaking of diversity, this brings us back to that crucial importance of biodiversity.
Yes, it does.
Can you remind us why biodiversity matters so much?
Of course. A diverse ecosystem is like a well-functioning team. Each species has its own unique role that contributes to the overall stability and resilience of that ecosystem. When you have lots of different niches filled, the ecosystem is better able to handle disturbances. It can bounce back from change.
It's like having a team of specialists, each with their own expertise, all working together to keep things running smoothly.
That's a great way to put it. But when you lose biodiversity, when species disappear or their niches are disrupted, it's like losing key members of that team. The ecosystem becomes less efficient, less resilient, more vulnerable to collapse.
So protecting biodiversity isn't just about saving the cute animals. It's about protecting the health and functioning of entire ecosystems.
Exactly. And understanding those ecological niches helps us appreciate why biodiversity is so vital. Every species, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, has a unique and crucial role to play.
It really is like a giant, intricate web, and every single thread is important.
Now, circling back to those initial questions we posed, what are the advantages of specialized modes of nutrition? And how are a species' adaptations related to its niche?
Okay, so after all this discussion, what's the answer? What have we learned?
Well, we've seen that specialized modes of nutrition help species reduce competition. They focus on specific resources, which drives biodiversity and ensures that each species has a unique role.
And when it comes to adaptations, it seems pretty clear that a species' adaptations, whether it's their teeth or claws or their behavior or their ability to tolerate certain conditions, that's what allows them to occupy a particular niche.
You got it. Adaptations are their tools for carrying out their ecological job. And those adaptations, as we've seen, can be incredibly diverse and fascinating.
It's like nature has an endless supply of creativity when it comes to equipping species for their unique roles.
It really does, and this understanding has really important implications for conservation.
Okay, I'm curious. How does it all tie into conservation efforts?
When we understand a species' niche, their needs, and their interactions, we can better protect their habitat and manage their populations.
So it's like having a detailed job description for each species so we know exactly what they need to thrive.
Precisely. We can identify crucial resources, potential threats, and even ways to minimize human impact by considering the niche of each species we're trying to conserve.
It's like being a career counselor for endangered species.
In a way, yes. And this knowledge can inform everything from habitat restoration projects to wildlife management strategies.
Wow, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to just how complex and interconnected these ecosystems are.
I'm glad to hear that.
So polar bear, for example, they're adapted to those frigid Arctic temperatures. They wouldn't last long in a tropical rainforest.
Not a chance. Their tolerance for heat would be way off. And these limits can even vary within a species depending on their life stage.
Oh, interesting. So a baby sea turtle might have different tolerance limits than an adult sea turtle.
Exactly. Or think about those shade-tolerant plants. As seedlings, they might handle some shade, but as they grow, they often need more sunlight to compete.
So their tolerance for light actually changes as they develop.
It does, which shows just how complex and dynamic ecological niches can be. They're not fixed categories. They're affected by all sorts of things, from a species' life stage to their interactions to changes in the environment itself.
It's like trying to hit a moving target. How can scientists even study something so fluid?
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But by observing them in their natural environment and conducting experiments, we can start to unravel these complexities. And this knowledge is especially crucial for conservation.
Right, because if we understand a species' tolerance limits, we can better protect them.
Absolutely. If we know their limits for temperature, for instance, we can predict how they might be affected by things like climate change.
So we can figure out which populations are most at risk and maybe even help them adapt.
Exactly. We might think about things like creating habitat corridors so species can move to more suitable areas, or even assisted migration programs to help them relocate.
Giving them a helping hand to adjust.
Exactly. And it all comes back to why understanding ecological niches is so important. It helps us see the big picture of life on Earth.
It's like we're learning to read the language of nature, how these species interact, how they adapt, how they depend on each other. All these incredible ecosystems.
And that understanding is so important, especially now with all the environmental challenges we're facing. We need to use this knowledge to make smart decisions.
About how we manage our planet and make sure all species, including us, can survive.
Well said.
It's been quite a journey, exploring this world of ecological niches.
It really has. I hope our listeners, and especially Mr. Martin's IB biology students, have a deeper appreciation for how nature works.
I'm sure they do. This isn't just about passing exams, it's about understanding the balance of life and becoming better stewards of our planet.
Absolutely. Recognizing that every species, no matter how small, has a vital role to play.
And that we humans are a part of that web of life, too. Our actions matter.
Couldn't said it better myself. It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into ecological niches. We hope you learned a lot and enjoyed the journey.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep asking those questions about the world around us.